So after that preamble, let me just introduce Luke. Dr. Luke Roberts has spent over 20 years in conflict resolution, a crucial area of practice for him. He's worked for a range of organisations, including Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Services, and increasingly in an NHS setting, and in particular with my colleagues up in the Leadership Academy in North Eastern Yorkshire. He's also working with CCGs to support them as they go through the transition currently into ICS. He completed a PhD in the area of complex adaptive systems, which is what his contribution in terms of his practice and his scholarship, I think, will turn out to be particularly engaging and very, very provocative for us. So in keeping with these kind of events, what tends to happen, I'm going to ask Luke to take 15 minutes just to do some introductory remarks, and he does have a slide deck to support that. And thereafter, Luke and I will have a conversation off the back of the questions that people helpfully provided in the run-up to this event. And we'll run right the way through to 3 o'clock with those questions, because I think we've got so many of them, we should try and cover as many as we can. Right, I'll stop and hand over to Luke. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, pleasure, Mark. And please do put comments in the chat as well as the other questions as well, because I hate losing questions. I'm going to hopefully share my slides and not leave the meeting. So, brilliant. That works again. He said optimistically. Yep. Okay, fabulous. So thank you everyone for joining me today. So I'll kind of start with what I'm not interested in. So from my perspective, I'm not really interested in the components of things. So I'm not interested in particular projects, initiatives, pathways. I'm not interested in objects, basically. And I'm not really interested in individuals either. Who people are and what they do doesn't really concern me at all. And then also, I'm not really interested in the promise of modernity, which is that we will find some kind of technological solution to solve our kind of crises and our situations as well. So from my perspective, I'm interested in, I think, ultimately, what are the spaces between? And so that's what interests me and gets my attention. But I'll justify that a bit more. So from my perspective, when I was kind of like thinking about systems, I used to work in local authority many moons ago, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated with watching projects and interventions happen in communities and not be sustainable long term. And I was starting to wonder, to what extent am I doing a disservice in the work I'm doing by saying I'm going to promote a particular anti-violence or conflict resolution model, but it doesn't last particularly long. It might last about 3 years, and then things move on. I was then kind of invited to do some work in the Metropolitan Police and realised I did not understand their organisation at all. So went off to do an MBA, particularly looking at creativity in business and culture. And so what I saw with the Met Police was that, again, lots of real interest at the beginning, implementation stage, but very little understanding of how to embed and what practice would really look like as well. So I went back into, well, I went into kind of the education field and started to look at whole organisational change models, because everyone says, like, you've got like the whole prison approach, the whole school approach, you might even have the whole hospital approach. I was like, well, where is it if this is what everybody's talking about? And it's quite hard to find, actually. So I said, well, if that's not helping build sustainable change, then what is it that I should be thinking about? And this is when my PhD kind of led me to think about, firstly, complexity theory, and then looking at systems thinking as ways to say, well, how do we sustain the good things that we want over time as well? So the kind of the typology of change models I came up with was kind of looking at 4 different types. So often people talk about the hero innovator. So this is the assumption that you can send one person on a training course and they can come back in and change the organisation. That might have been true in a time when organisations were relatively small, but it's impossible now. And I also think that when we're thinking about putting people on training, what we're assuming is that by changing the knowledge in people's heads, that changes organisations and thus systems. I don't think that's true. The second type of model is around pockets of practice. And so pockets of practice have potentially greater sustainability because you have a small group of people who are able to do a task within the system. They might even become a microsystem in and of themselves, a niche in systems language. But the danger with pockets of practice is often they burn out over time, that group of people, or you'll start to see lots of change. And I saw that quite a lot in the educational sector, where you might have a really strong team, but that strong team doesn't get wider system support. And over time can often be seen as maverick or rebellious, rather than recognizing the advantages that that team might bring to the system. The third type of model of change, going back to my point about the whole school or whole organizational approach, was I started to become concerned that organizations were saying, like, we want, I don't know, equalities training, mental health and well-being training, like whatever training you want for your entire staff. And the danger with that is that you create a veneer and icing on the organization that looks like change, but the fundamental structures that reproduce inequality or reproduce poor mental health outcomes stay the same. So it's a bit like a chocolate cake is always a chocolate cake, regardless of what type of icing and flavors you put on top of it, the structure fundamentally remains the same. So I started to kind of go, right, if this is what lots of people are talking about in terms of the whole organizational approach, I didn't see any evidence that it was an effective form of change model. So this kind of led me to thinking about ecosystems.
Press 1. For anything else, please press 2.
Okay. So when looking at kind of like ecosystems, I started to become interested in, well, what needs to be grown, what needs to be nurtured, what gets killed off? And kind of saying, is this a better understanding of the process of change that organizations go through? And then within that, well, what's the type of change that interests me? So when I started kind of looking at ecosystemic thinking about organizational change, like I said, originally I was interested in individuals, but then not so much. I started to focus on, well, what are the situations individuals find themselves in? And those situations are often created by organizations. And so that interplay started to really interest me. And then within that, what's the kind of the policy framework that influences individuals, that influences situations? So you can almost see like a Russian doll model starting to appear here. And then what's like the wider environment? So the environment can be things you have no control over at all. So this is where kind of like thinking about the ecosystem became really interesting to me. And then my critique was that often it felt like when you look at organizational management thinking, when they tend to talk about systems, they tend to talk about like kind of hard systems, like the NHS is like an engine or the NHS is like a production line. And what this kind of overlies is the fact that we're still thinking in a really mechanistic way that came from the industrial era around how we think about change. And this really kind of sparked off an insight in my mind, which was when I think about the projects and initiatives I've worked on, they're almost like, well, here's a cog in the machine. I can change that cog and it will produce new outcomes. But then that cog isn't really connected to anything else. And over time, the system will revert back to whatever its previous behavior was before. So I'm quite critical of hard systems thinking, unless you recognize that you're actually doing it, that's not necessarily the default. So this is what led me to think about ecosystemic change and wanting to think about soft systems. And so complexity theory has the potential, I would argue, to be one of those things. And what kind of got me interested was that, like, when I sometimes talk about or read about complexity, often it felt like people were creating simulations and testing them against reality. So here's my mental map of the world, and now I'm going to develop some software or use computer generated understanding of, is that model actually reflective of reality? And I thought there's a different way in which we can approach this. So from my mind, I'm not interested in creating computer simulations. I'm much more interested in engaging with people. So what I kind of started to focus in on was, if we're thinking about a complexity approach, how do people in the system define the system? And it's really interesting that talking to people in the NHS, it's like almost they want to go straight into like an action, a target, a thing. And it's about going, well, stepping back and, well, what's the interactions that are at play here? And how does those interactions create a system around you? And do you see it? Because I tend to say like systems are hidden in the everyday. So how do people go about defining their systems? Is the first thing. And so then the second thing is about visualizing the systems of interaction. And so if we want to talk about something like health inequality, well, what are the interactions or the lack of action in the system that allows that system behavior to reproduce time and time again? And so for me, starting to create ways in which people can map out and visualize their own system becomes really interesting and really exciting. And then the final part is, well, what are the applied solutions that we can do at a systems level? So again, the temptation in terms of a system dominance is to go back into, well, what's the target? But like I said, I'm interested in the space between the interactions. So what are the interactions that need to change that can generate new solutions? So the picture you're seeing is a session I did last Thursday up in Sheffield, where we had nurse educators who were talking about what does it mean to be a nurse educator in a system that feels like it's always changing. And so how do we then think about the future of the way in which nurses are going to be trained, knowing that the system will change around us? So they really went for it and kind of, you know, we visualized their system together and started to look at, well, what will be some of the potential system indicators? And I did this on Friday as well with other senior leaders in Sheffield and Doncaster, I think, as well. So again, just helping people to visualize the system, but not being prescriptive with what they are going to come up with. Because for me, when we're looking at complex adaptive systems, it's very much about saying, where are the opportunities for things to emerge rather than things to be prescribed? And I think that's really important, because often what I've seen running these kinds of sessions is that there's a real creativity bubbling away, but the danger is that creativity is then pushed towards becoming some kind of action plan, rather than saying, well, how do we create more divergent ways to engage with our systems? So here's something that I kind of did with the Humber ICS, where we were talking about visualizing their system and using a complexity framework. And what you can see within their visualization is we talked about, well, what's in and out of the system. And that sounds like ridiculously simple. In physical systems, it's quite easy to say what is in and out of the system. But in social systems, it becomes a lot harder to recognize, well, what is in and what is out of the system. We also talked about the experience of time. And I thought that they would say, like, time is really pressurized and always kind of going forward at speed. And what kind of came out of the conversation was, if you stay in the NHS long enough, you'll see time as a circle where you kind of go around these policy loops between what, you know, expansion and contraction of the system. And I thought that's just such a fascinating way to describe the experience of time in their systems. And then we kind of started to talk about, well, what's their present metaphor of the system? So, you know, I can say this because she's not here. Like, my wife always goes, like, the moment you start talking about systems, I get really bored. But once you start talking about systems, when you're applying it to something, I can see why it's interesting. And so what they did in their kind of session was talk about the NHS as a sausage factory. And so you're always going to get potato and mash as a patient, regardless of what you think you're asking for. But if we could really use the ICS as a way of creating emergent properties in the system, a future system would be much more bespoke, much more personalized, much more, and they kind of said, like, their future metaphor is a bit more like Amazon in terms of having enough data to really anticipate need as well. So it's just, again, this is them coming up with their own descriptions and visualizations of the system. And then the question then becomes, well, what are some of the system indicators that tell you that your system is tipping into a new behavior? So it's a lovely piece of work to be doing across some of the CCGs there as well. And again, the level of creativity was absolutely fascinating to see. So in terms of my own metaphor, I'm really interested in kind of living bridges. So these are bridges that are grown in the northeast of India. And they are bridges that take about 60 years to grow across a ravine, but they tend to last for about 700 years. So for me, they are the perfect kind of complement between intentional design and blending into your ecosystem. So from my perspective, when we're thinking about complex systems change, it's about how do we make sure that the things we're really developing are sustainable in the ecosystems long after we're gone. Right, I'm going to end the presentation there and hopefully not leave the meeting.
Fantastic, thank you. So we'll start with bridges, because I think that was a fantastic picture. It reminds you of the importance of thinking how you bridge things. To talk about that, as you were speaking, I was thinking there can be quite a tension between quite a lot of the structural activity that gets pursued, particularly in corporate settings, and what you seem to be talking about in terms of the vitality of the relational. So making those connections. How in your work do you try and balance that when clients potentially are talking about structure and governance, as we're all probably aware, but in the way you've just described it, it's more about the relational that gets this stuff started. So how do you create that balance?
So I think that, what is it? Well, all systems need some form of structure, otherwise they just lose energy. I think the challenge is that it feels like that because there's perpetual change, some of those structures become really resilient to change, because that's then the survival aspect. And then there's the other aspect, which is what are the things that are perceived in the system that are immutable and never change, but actually you can play with them. The boundaries aren't as hard as they look. There's a bit more fluidity there. And so again, it's about really helping to recognize, well, where are some of those perceived boundaries holding us back? And how do we cross or bridge them to create different system states? And I think that's, for me, I'm not a content specialist. People in the system know their system better than me, but what I can do is kind of provoke a response and kind of go, well, does it have to be that way? And if not, what else could be happening as well?
That's good. Just to show some sympathy for your wife in terms of what you said, but also from my perspective. So if I try and talk to leaders about systems and complexity, I can see them tensing up and being really quite uncomfortable because it's a topic that doesn't land terribly well. So I think the way you spoke about locating the thinking about complexity in practice and being able to articulate that seems an essential thing. Otherwise, you are just creating anxiety in the system. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about what your key learnings had been around complexity in terms of the experience of the pandemic over the past 2 or so years. And so what do you take from that experience that helps you think and talk about complexity, if anything?
Now there's a question. I think, what is it? In the first instance, finding the way in which people describe their own system is really interesting. So I was working with a prison governor, and she said, like, we have a problem with socks. And this is like classic prison language here, which is, basically the men keep on hitting each other over the head with socks with snooker balls in them, kind of thing. So we should ban socks. So that's component thinking in place there, kind of thing. But then when we expand it and say, well, okay, so let's take that logic forward. If they don't use socks, what are they going to use next? Their underwear, kind of thing. Are you going to ban underwear? So the way in which you're going to prevent, the thing you don't want in the system is to have everyone naked in the end. Like, that's the logical conclusion to that way of thinking of banning components. Whereas if we start to look at interaction and start to look at why is it that people feel the need to commit acts of violence? What's the ecosystem around them? Remember what I said, and what are the situations that generate that? That becomes a much more interesting conversation. And so for me, I think there is something about people can be incredibly intuitive with feeling and understanding their systems. But often, management theory takes you back to think about the component rather than the interactions. So I think that's really important. To systems thinking and complexity can allow different conversations and wider conversations, as well as finding either the problem or the right metaphor to describe that problem as well. So in the prison service, in the youth estate, I tend to call conflict as a game because of the way in which it's played, and that seems to really resonate. The metaphor of a game. It's a very serious game, but once you understand it as a game, you can then disrupt it through systems thinking. Whereas I think the second part of your question, Mark, in terms of in a response to the pandemic, COVID displayed the classic signs of a complex adaptive system. It amplified itself. There was lots of feedback. Then there was social consequences to that in terms of stockpiling toilet roll, for example. No one predicted that, did they? So at that point, again, all those linear planning things tended to break down because we needed to be much more flexible, much more adaptable, much more boundary crossing than was probably the case because of the needs of the system to be able to sustain itself. And there's those moments in time. So I think some of the learning that has come from the pandemic is in danger of being lost as the system reverts back to its default position. And I think there's a consequence to that, which is remember what I said, how do we sustain the good? It's a lot harder than we think sometimes from that aspect. And I think also looking at the way in which, like, the metaphor of waves comes in as well is a really powerful one. And so again, as leaders, how do we, or as people interested in complexity, how do we engage with the system to either build more resilience around these waves, or finding ways in which we can change the way our energy flows in the system to accommodate the fact that there will be these waves that may sweep through, but they don't have to destroy good things along the way.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. That's really, really helpful. As you, I should say to the audience that if you've got questions or comments that are occurring to you as we have this conversation, drop them in the chat box, and I'll try and pull them across into the conversation as we go along. Because obviously I have a schedule of questions and things I'd like to talk to Luke about, but I want to make sure that everyone's getting a fair bite of the cherry. So drop some stuff in. We'll pick that up. Just to think about that issue of leadership. You know, it is my view that there's a very, very traditional view of leadership that prevails, which is it's directive, it's linear, it's pull lever A and outcome B happens. And notwithstanding all the different ways of thinking about leadership that exist, that's what tends to underlie most leadership, and particularly in the health service. But if we're saying that complexity is telling us that the world is unknowable and uncertain, that seems to nudge up against that traditional view of leadership. So if that's the case, what is left for leaders to do if we're taking complexity seriously?
Ooh, okay. Right, I think with that question, so again, it goes back to when we talk about systems change, if you think about systems as machines, then it's really clear what the leader needs to do in terms of pulling levers, etc. Because you're trying to produce particular types of outcome time and time again, which is okay if you're in a really stable environment where you have enough resource to meet the outputs. Whereas in a complex system, by the very nature of the fact that the environment will change and we will change in response to the change kind of thing, you've got a dynamic in play. It means that way of thinking might have been great at the turn of the century, but it's probably not appropriate now. And so when we're thinking about complexity and leadership, it's really about kind of going back to some of the points I made earlier, which is how do we understand our present system as a dynamic system that is open to change, that has boundaries, that will have an experience of time. And so it's how do leaders engage with those conversations. So what I found really interesting in some of the NHS work is listening to different parts talk about their own history, and that history tells you how they've got to the present, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how they're going to get to the future. But it's really important to validate history, whereas in machine management, you don't have to acknowledge history at all, because it's just a clear line of progress. Oh, something's broken, fix it, progress kind of thing. So it's important to recognize the social history, because that feeds into culture. But also, I think the creativity aspect of complexity is not about targets or setting like specific micro goals, but recognizing, well, what is the emergent potential in the system for some quite either radical or localized change, because people in the system tend to know their needs best. And so I think there's a real empowering aspect that leaders can do, which is how do I create the conditions for emergence to happen without prescribing the end result of that emergence? And so that means that we have to have different stakeholder engagement. We have to recognize different voices. And so for leaders, it's about trying to create greater openness within the system and recognizing interaction. So to give an example, if we think about health inequality, if everybody is doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, why does health inequality exist in the system? Because it's a feature of the system that is not dependent on any single part of the system. Yeah. It is a feature that comes from the interactions of the system itself. So which means that, you know, for leaders saying, well, we need to set a target about health inequality. Well, you've now just broken it down into a component. So then don't be surprised when the system surprises you, because you've reduced it to try and manage it. and yet the system itself of inequality will continue to perpetuate because you're not engaging with it at a systems level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does. I keep talking about that antique toy that I had, and I suspect many people don't now have, which was the kaleidoscope, where you look down a tube and it was a set of crystals, and if you twisted the tube slightly, the crystal was reformed into a different pattern. And I keep trying to use that as a way of saying, if you make a slight adjustment in terms of one component, it'll reset the pattern, but it won't necessarily fix what you're trying to fix. So I think the stuff about health inequalities is vitally important. And I very often talk about that kind of target setting is quite unhelpful in many ways, because you drift into a space where you're just consumed by the idea of the target and your connection to it, instead of thinking about the system as an organic space where things may develop, but you need to be prepared to allow them to emerge. And I always get quite nervous about the term emergence, because it's such a leadership academy word. As soon as I say it in meetings, I can see people go, "Oh, leadership academy," but it's really important as a term, and it's very apparent in many ways. And I imagine you can think of examples where you could talk about your practice and where emergence was very obvious in a system.
Yep, absolutely, Mark. And I think there's a question what you're saying there for me, which is like, again, my wife will go, emergence, boring, you know, so what's the creative connections that we can make? And then, so I gave this example last week, like, let's say I have a brilliant idea that can really help, you know, change a patient journey. How does the system allow that idea to travel through it to create meaningful change? And so it's really interesting, which is like, well, who do you know? Do you know the right people? You know, how do you navigate? How does that idea navigate through the system? And how does it build connection as it goes? And so this is where, for me, this idea of emergence is that it's a property of the system that can fundamentally change its behavior. So I'm all for this idea of linking emergence and creativity. But the flip side of emergence is you can have emergence in the system with things you don't want. So you can end up with a bullying culture that has emerged, not because anyone has particularly decided that that's what they want, but by the lack of no feedback as a form of feedback, which is, you know, if bullying goes unchallenged within the system, it then starts to be seen as a narrative within the system, and then the behaviours of that then might get rewarded. That's an emergent property of the system as well. It's just something we don't want. So going back to your previous question, as leaders, you've both got to work out what's the things you do want to happen in the system and what's the things you need to guard against, because emergence is always there trying to bring itself out in some shape, form or fashion.
Yeah. As we've been talking, I was thinking a couple of examples that have cropped up for me in terms of being able to think about the complexity that underpins health and social care systems. So the first one that cropped up for me recently was the stuff around knife crime in Glasgow, where, you know, an overarching kind of headline decision was not to think of it as a criminological issue, but to think about it as a public health issue. And it struck me from what I've read, and I'd be really interested in your understanding of it and experience of it, but from what I've read, it suggested that simple shift in mindset allowed people to work differently and for the system to function differently. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that particular example, whether there are better ones.
Okay, right. So the lens you look at the system through can be really powerful. So shifting from a criminal justice understanding of violence to a health understanding of violence may create new properties and new ideas and new collaborations in the system. Totally get that. My concern is that the danger is that by treating it as a health model, we're still not allowing the most marginalized voices to contribute to knowing and solving the problems in the system. So it's almost like we're therapizing them and going, right, we can cure you of your violence. And the danger is you're taking it back to the individual rather than going, and I do get within the Scottish model and the public health model that there is this kind of view of we should look at some of the conditions around people. But I think the danger is that the outcomes lead back to the individual rather than the critique of the system that perpetuates violence in and of itself. So the shift in lenses is useful, but it's also important to recognize that, you know, one is not necessarily better than the other. It's just, what do you think you're trying to achieve in the system by using that lens? For me, I'm really interested in how we make sure that those people who are often outside of the system are allowed to participate within the system, and how does the system either shut down or enable new voices to be heard?
Yeah, that's really helpful, and it's interesting because I've just not spotted that and not thought it through. And yet, as soon as you said it, I thought, oh yes, it is a pathologization. And instead of a criminalization, it's a pathologization, which tends to be how people have argued Western societies in particular worked for many centuries. So thank you, that's really useful. And I guess the other point there, it's just thinking about that shift from one mindset to another reminds us that something like that is a wicked problem that doesn't necessarily have an end point, but needs to be constantly looked at afresh. And that means that you've not reached your destination, but just by changing a mindset, you're creating an opening where that change can persist and will need to keep going. Does that sound a reasonable summary, or am I going off?
No, I think that's fair, and I think again right. So with the language of systems thinking linked to a machine metaphor, that sounds like it's clarifying up ambiguity, because you've just got to do X, Y, and Z to produce a new outcome. Whereas sitting with the discomfort of not knowing can be a creative act in and of itself, but often leaders are like being told to be action orientated, rather than stepping back and going, right, actually, what are the interactions? What's the in between where I can make a difference? And so from my perspective, I think part of thinking in complex adaptive systems is, rather than trying to minimize or destroy ambiguity, it's saying, well, how do we embrace it? How do we recognize it as an opportunity? And then importantly, what's the way in which we want to tell a story about how going back to your point, part of the complex systems leader is, what's the narrative that can hold ambiguity, but also help people move through it to a different or a place where there's more benefit.
Great. Thank you, Luke. I spot that Matthew has shared some stuff about liberating structures as a potential way for people to start to get under the skin of this, because the difficulty for lots of people, I think, is because they're in the system, they're part of the system. It's not something you can take a look at like an abstract thing, if ever that was truly possible. Because we're all in the system, it's quite difficult then to visualize it, because we're implied in it. So having some problems and potential ways of rethinking that perspective is quite helpful. So thank you, Matthew, for sharing that. I just wondered, off the back of that, whether you'd got any suggestions about the ways in which people might challenge their own thinking in a reflexive way.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's, so kind of taking up that point, that I think there is a danger of organizational blindness, which is you're so familiar with your system and your environment that you just stop seeing things. So I find it fascinating when I've walked around prisons and gone, like, why do you do that? And everyone goes, I didn't even notice it was there, let alone like questioning it. So there is something about trying to see your environment, your relationships with fresh eyes, and do those fresh eyes pull things out for you. And again, going back to the point about having different voices. So if you're thinking about the patient journey and breaking that patient down by demographic, do they see the system in the same way as staff is really important. If somebody else from another ICS came and looked, would they see the same things as well? So this is, again, going back to my point about the ability to be open allows new information to come into the system, new views, new perspectives, but you've also got to be receptive to that as well. So rather than seeing the danger or the threat in what someone's saying, it's about going, well, actually, they have a perspective that probably I haven't heard or acknowledged before, and that's a useful thing to incorporate in, rather than simply kind of going like, then they don't know us as well as we know us, so then you end up with just kind of like tribalism and dismissing it.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions that come into the chat box. One is somebody asking about, do you think there's something akin to complex adaptive disruption? A system resets itself, kind of flushes out what might be positive. So does it have a shadow side, does it? Because they very often talk about the shadow side of organisations. So I wonder whether there was a shadow side in terms of systems resetting in a disruptive way.
I don't think systems can ever, all right, no, let me reframe that. I don't think complex systems can ever reset themselves. They have the legacy of history and change behind them. So you're either looking at a smaller part of the system, or the system has to have died in some way, which then means that it's not a reset. But within the second part of the question, I think what is important to recognise when you're looking at the world through a complex systems lens is what is the dominant system. So if I give an example from the education world, so schools in England are very interested in dealing with mental health, student well-being, etc. But the dominant system of behaviour is punitive. So it is not a benign or neutral environment in which any type of initiative you're trying to do is going to around student well-being and mental health is going to be receptive, because this dominant system is punitive. So this is where over time two things will happen. The punitive system will either kill off at some point that new intervention because it's too much of a threat, or it drains energy away from it. Or the second bit that's even more interesting to me is it co-opts it. So we can now talk about the language of mental health while you're in detention. We can now talk about your well-being while you're being excluded. And that is the bit that really captures my attention. So it's not necessarily even that there's a shadow side. It's just you've got to recognise what is the dominant system within the thing you're trying to intervene in.
Yeah, I think that strikes me as important, because you've talked about voices in systems as well. And it's clear that overlaying systems in many ways is a structural aspect, which is the hierarchical bit, which means there is a dominant view and there will be a dominant voice or dominant voices, and there will be subaltern voices. And I guess the real challenge, the quite radical challenge of working in a system space and acknowledging complexity, is to call out the fact that there is power in respect to those relations, and to start to talk about that up front, and to say, you know, the system is not a pure thing, it is overwritten with all sorts of cultural and other issues that actually need to be picked up. Couple of other questions coming through the chat box, which I'm obviously keen to share. Somebody has asked, and I'm going to crudely paraphrase here, a lot of our life is about feeding the beast, and the beast expectation is there's key performance indicators, and there's this and there's that, and the whole world is rag rated. The world only exists in red, amber and green. So there's that we're obliged to do, particularly in the NHS, and the expectation of targets and being driven by targets, and the whole new public management issue that means we're so dominated by that, alongside actually wanting to intervene and work in a systemic way. And I just wonder whether you've got any observations about how you might strike that balance.
Yeah, so rag-rated systems are fascinating because it's the reduction of complexity. And then you end up with, like, you know, we've got green amber, and then we've got amber red, and, like, you know, so that, like, the traffic light suddenly becomes a bit more of a spectrum of colours, because what we're trying to say is, like, actually the system is so complex, the things that we thought were simple don't fit neatly into the boxes. So I think, again, when you get to that stage, you've just got to acknowledge that probably the model of rag rating is breaking down. But there's something that's really interesting within rag rating, which is you can dehumanize aspects of the system as well, so that people's relationships don't matter, just the outcomes that happen. And I think the danger in that is that then this is where inequality creeps in through dehumanizing. So we lose narrative, we lose story, we lose experience. Just by the fact that something is now green doesn't necessarily mean it's achieving a healthy outcome. It just means from the perspective of the person in that system, from their viewpoint, it's not a problem for them. So I think there's that aspect. I also think that there is a danger within management, which is we plan to plan all the time. And so you don't actually take meaningful action in the system, because we'll discuss the action plan that we're going to write in the next meeting, after the meeting we're having, about how to plan for that meeting. Loads of time being consumed by the system. And that goes back to the point about feeding the beast, that actually the rituals, that's the dominant system playing out. that in terms of the measures of success is, you know, how well we stuck to the action plan rather than how well has the action plan reflected the reality of the system and the ways in which we want to apply change within that system as well. But it's really easy to get lost in that because it's such an ingrained part of the system that if you want to be successful, you've got to demonstrate success through all of these kind of action plans. But that's the dominant system, the machine metaphor at play again. So then we wonder why things don't work the way they should. So I think there's that bit. And then I think in terms of kind of a potential solution, one of the things that really interests me is around kind of saying, well, not just where are the voices of people in the system and who's in and who's out, but what is the kind of, what is an interaction that can be changed in the system? So again, this is both boundary crossing and saying, well, you know, who's a group that, you know, we don't usually get to speak to? Can we hear their voice, and what's the emergent thing that would come out of that new relationship? So from a well, I guess from a socially complex perspective, it's all about the web of relationships that we have and how we use those. And importantly, if a particular partner doesn't show up to a meeting continuously, like we're talking about child health, and you know, social care doesn't show up, or police don't show up, that feedback is really important because they're not engaging with your system for a reason. And are we competent and confident enough to go and challenge them? Or do we just accept that no feedback, you know, they always do that. But that's where, you know, you're starting to kind of go, recognizing the absence of action is a feature of the system.
Yeah. I think that's something that's particularly important as we talk about integrated care systems, because I think this is a personal view, but there's quite a lot of positioning and performance in that space, which means that progress is slowed up because people aren't having candid exchanges, relational exchanges about what their position might be, what they find tolerable. It's a degraded term because of Syria, but stuff about red lines, you know, for everybody speaking in the system, they will have expectations and red lines about their tolerances about what to do and how to do it. But a lot of the time, we're not actually having conversations about that. Now, that's not to say we won't have conversations longer term, but it strikes me as quite important because that does go to the discussion about power in the system. And it allows people then to think about working as a network rather than just thinking of themselves as independent agents that might just bump against each other occasionally. To follow on from the question we just had about feeding the beast and working systemically, somebody's asked, it's another balance question. So there's something about how do you infuse and capture energy for people to work in a systems space in a systemic way, whilst at the same time not having constantly taking some sort of obscure responsibility for every element of the system. So a balance between investing time in doing systems work, but not feeling that you're trying to fix the system or having to attend to every element. So again, do you have any thoughts about that balance?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a danger within the hierarchical model, which is that the people at the top know the system. And I think what I'm saying all the way through this is actually the system is too complex for any one person or any one group to know. And this is why you need to have feedback loops continuously in the system. So the system is sensitive to change coming from various places. So I think there's that aspect. And then I think in terms of what you've just said there, Mark, there's a question about what are the types of communities we belong to, and do we have a diversity of networks? So I think one of the things where I think power lies is in not in just the ability to be accountable and be responsible, but the ability to connect and to connect through different types of networks as well. So, you know, it's the equivalent of, like, someone said to me, like, Luke, you're the only person I know who can walk into a prison in the morning and then be in Google in the afternoon. You know, like, your diversity of networks is just so great, kind of thing. And I think within the system, again, it's that opportunity to say, well, where's the diversity of my own networks to do some of that systems thinking?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think you're right with the hierarchy stuff, because Hierarchy is constantly propped up by the picture of the pyramid. So it's a metaphor alongside the machine metaphor. There's the pyramid that tells us that's the natural state. You know, if you talk to people and say, can you describe your organization? It'll end up looking like a pyramid. And I keep saying to people, stop looking at the pyramid. Try and get over the pyramid and look down on it, and then start to think about how that might network. And I think you're right. It creates the conceit that if you're at the top of the structure, you can see the structure, but you can't, because sometimes all sorts of things will get in the way and stop you from seeing it. So I think there's a sense that people at the top of organizations think they can see the system, but I think, as you said, the system is complex, constantly changing, so a sense that you can capture it and see it forever is completely illusory. And I was just thinking about voice, and it's something that preoccupies me at the moment. I was having a conversation with John Higgins the other day about it. We were discussing the term human resources, and just how problematic that is for a profession that seeks to put people at the centre of its work. Because as soon as you talk about a human resource, you don't have a conversation with a resource. A resource is a thing, but you can have a conversation with a human. And it strikes me, if you're trying to work systemically, you've got to move past that, start thinking human to human, networked across different spaces to actually start to have the meaningful conversations. Otherwise, they're overwritten with all sorts of issues, as we've started to discuss today. We've got 9 minutes. It's gone very quickly. So I just wanted to pick up, because people always like a takeaway from a meeting like this. So I have a couple of questions which are kind of came out of people's original submissions prior to the meeting, which is, what can I do? What do I do next? So I'm just thinking, how best could people leaving today's meetings, taking Myron Rogers' observation of connecting more of the system to itself, and perhaps effacing their boundaries a little and expanding their practice, what could they do? What one thing could they take out to try and connect the system to itself?
You won't be able to box me in that way, Mark. That like defeats the whole purpose of the talk, to say, well, actually, complex thinking can be done in one way. No, sorry, I can't do that for you. What I can say is this. Thinking about after this meeting, like, just look for other complex systems. Like one of my big epiphanies when I was like, I'm a system, your system is a light switcher system. Kind of just start to see interconnection would be one thing that becomes really helpful. Some students I gave a lecture to, they said, are you like Neo in the Matrix? Like all you see is systems now. And I was like, yeah, actually, it's really hard. It's hard to unsee systems once you see systems. So I'd say that's definitely something to think about going forward. And I'd also say, just try and map out your networks as well. You belong to a whole, including your family, your social, and just start to see the levels of interconnection that happen around us becomes really important. And I guess, in a more professional level, there's something about, going back to my point about voice, who is not being heard in your present system? And if you don't know, maybe there's a conversation to have with others. I think that's really crucial. So, and then I think there's something about to what extent does language depersonalize? So we've talked about the RAG rating, we've talked about the triangle. Could you draw a different version of an organizational structure and just show it to other people? Say, does this give us a closer reflection of reality? So I'm totally anti-Maslow. My sister's a psychologist, and I always say it's a load of rubbish because he just nicked it from the TP, from the Native Americans. So but what I'm doing there is challenging the fundamental visualization of Maslow. And what are the ways in which we can challenge some of these assumptions that hold the system to its present system state is what I'd ask people to think about. And so when we're talking about, things like, the patient care journey, to what extent have we included voices of patients in that? And in what way do we think that has actually fed back into the system? Or are we back to patient voice, tick box, done, move on kind of thing? So again, looking at interaction rather than component thinking.
I think that's a really important contribution, because it strikes me in terms of work I'm currently doing that a lot of the time organizations and people in them are trained to demonstrate that they're listening. So there's lots of listening. You know, people are trained to do it. They tilt their head, they cross their arms, they make nice noises, but not much hearing is going on. And certainly my experience from the pandemic was people felt their voice was going out into the spaces where they were working, but it wasn't being heard. Even if someone seemed to be listening, it wasn't being heard. So I think your contribution there, Lou, just reminds us about the importance that it's not just going through the process of listening, which is what many organisations have found a satisfactory level in terms of doing. It's about, can you start to listen differently? And can you actually hear what people are saying as they start to bear witness? And I think it's vitally important to then interrogate your circumstances. So look anew at what's around you and say, if I hear this voice, it might be in a document, it might come through a meeting, it's in a memo, if memos still exist, I have no idea. It might be in an email. How am I hearing that voice? And why is that voice the one that's being listened to? And where are the quieter voices that are perhaps not being listened to, or they might be listened to and not heard? So there's something really important about looking at the system, looking at your networks as you've described, but also interrogating the context where you find yourself and say, how has this become what it is? It's basic kind of deconstruction in many ways, looking at every artifact of organizational and systems life and saying, where's this come from? What's it saying? What's it saying between the lines? Because otherwise we're not going to hear subaltern voices. We're just going to hear a dominant voice. And as you said earlier in the talk, there's a real danger of just reproducing the past, because organizations have a powerful capacity to do precisely that. I guess the final thing is what lots of people say to me is, when you talk about system, it just gets bigger and bigger. I don't know where to pull down the boundaries. So I just wonder if you've got any thoughts from practice about what reassurances you can give to people about that, because I can see how it would make people anxious. I can see the logic of it from a complexity perspective. It's almost fractal in its thinking, but I can see why people get twitchy about, or I could just follow that to the nth degree. So I just wonder from practice whether you got any observations on that.
Sure. I think it was the tennis player Arthur Ashe who said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think that's a brilliant point on which to finish, because Arthur Ashe was such a spectacular player. I remember watching it during Wimbledon. I would come home from school and my mother would avidly watch Wimbledon, so I'd sit and watch it with her. So I don't know why I'm reminiscing, it just helps me, I think. Thank you for allowing me to do that. Luke, I just want to say thank you so much for the past hour. That's been really amazing. I've really enjoyed that conversation, and I genuinely hope for those people that have been with us today and joined this discussion that it's been a good use of your time, and there's stuff there that's been of use for you, and that you might take it away and reflect on it and have some fresh thoughts. A quick marketing blurb. So this is the first of our 4 sessions this year. We've got one looking at innovation. We've got one looking at how can you think about metrics when you're thinking about complexity, which could be quite a challenging conversation. And just like trying to name various characters in films, I've lost the 4th one, but I remember the 4th one. It's about the use of networks for medical staff to start to address health inequalities, learning networks. And then off in February, which seems a long way away, but time trickles through our fingers like sand. Off in February, we've got a session called Why Networks Matter. And it's looking at the centrality of networks in terms of supporting people to think in systems fashions, but also why networks are important from an inclusion perspective. So we're taking a dual position on this and trying to have a conversation about networking and its importance to everyone in an organisation. So that's the clumsy advertisement at the end. And I'll just repeat my thanks to Luke. And thanks to everybody who joined the call today. And I genuinely hope it's been a good use of your time. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Just to say, I've sent you the PDF version of the slides as well, so that can go out.
I'll send that out. And definitely, I can stop recording. That's a perfect reminder. Yeah.